Here are 15 exam questions on DP-203, Data Engineering on Microsoft Azure. So the first question is, you need to trigger an Azure Data Factory pipeline when a file arrives in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container. Which resource provider should you enable? And the options are A, Azure SQL, B, Azure Automation, C, Azure Event Grid, D, Azure Event Hubs. To trigger a pipeline based on events happening in storage account, like when a file arrives in the storage or gets deleted from the storage in Azure Blob Storage account, what you can do on Data Factory is using the Azure Event Grid. So Data Factory and Synapse pipelines natively integrate with Azure Event Grid, and it allows you to trigger pipelines on such events. Just going over the wrong answers here. A, Azure SQL is not the right answer. It's just a family of SQL cloud databases. B, Azure Automation is more to do with the process automation and things like configuration and update management. It doesn't really have to do it with trigger. D, Azure Event Hub is a platform to stream big data and ingest events. It's a front door to events, but does not trigger actions based on events. So in this case, the right answer is C, Azure Event Grid. Question 2. You plan to perform batch processing in Azure Databricks once daily. Which type of Databricks cluster should you use? A, high concurrency, B, job, C, all-purpose. For cluster types, Azure Databricks makes a distinction between all-purpose clusters and job clusters. We know the answer is one of those two. You use all-purpose clusters when we want to analyze data collaboratively using interactive notebooks. You use job clusters to run fast and robust automated jobs. Since in this question we plan to perform batch processing daily, the correct answer is B, job clusters. Option A, high concurrency, isn't really a type of cluster. It's a mode of cluster. So there are 3 cluster modes: standard, high concurrency, and single node. And they're more to do with the amount of data that's being processed. So it's not very relevant. Question 3. You're processing streaming data from vehicles that pass through a toll booth. You need to use Azure Stream Analytics to return the license plate, vehicle make, and an hour the last vehicle passed during each 10-minute window. How should you complete the query? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. The most important part of this question is to understand what each of these windowing functions do. So we have hopping window, session window, sliding window, tumbling window, and from there on we can narrow down our options. The first question is, what are windowing functions? So if you think about applications that deal with time, it is common to group events using some sort of temporal vectors as categories. And in Azure Stream Analytics, these windowing functions are used to group these events together. It sounds all confusing, but probably the easiest way to go about it is through examples. So let's first have a look at hopping window. So if someone asks, every 5 seconds, give me the count of tweets over the last 10 seconds, then we consider a windowing function called the hopping window. So a 10-second hopping window with a 5-second hop. Second windowing function we consider is tumbling window. If someone says, tell me the count of tweets per time zone every 10 seconds, then we'll be looking at the number of tweets every 10 seconds. This window is comparable to hopping window because hopping windows had overlaps between them, whereas tumbling window doesn't. Actually, tumbling window is a special case of hopping window. So if you imagine hopping window having the hop that being the same length as the length of the window, then you get the tumbling window. Now the sliding window is an interesting one. So if someone asks, alert me whenever a topic is mentioned more than 3 times under 10 seconds, then we consider a 10-second sliding window. And the interesting thing about sliding window is that they get used to consider all possible windows of a given length. So they are different from tumbling or hopping windows in that they only output events only for points in time when the content of the window actually changes. So in this case, for example, the only times that they will have an output would be when a topic is mentioned more than 3 times under 10 seconds. We also have the session window. Session window is considered when someone asks, tell me the count of tweets that occur within 5 minutes to each other. The main idea of session window is basically to group events that happen at a similar time. So in this case, session windows with 5 minutes timeout are considered. So in this question, we want to group vehicles passing during each 10-minute window. So the appropriate windowing function to consider would be 10-minute tumbling windows. That narrows down our options. So going further down the query, we see that the remaining options are date diff and date name. And reading the question again, one of the things we want to return is the last vehicle passed during each 10-minute window. So we want to compute the difference in time, which can be done by using the date diff function. So the correct answer is A. Question 4. You have an Azure Data Factory instance that contains 2 pipelines named Pipeline 1 and Pipeline 2. Pipeline 1 has the activities shown in the following exhibit. Pipeline 2 has the activities shown in the following exhibit. You execute Pipeline 2 and stored procedure in Pipeline 1 fails. What is the status of the pipeline runs? And the options are A. Pipeline 1 and Pipeline 2 succeeded. B. Pipeline 1 and Pipeline 2 failed. C. Pipeline 1 succeeded and Pipeline 2 failed. D. Pipeline 1 failed and Pipeline 2 succeeded. So in Data Factory, activities are linked by dependencies. So looking at Pipeline 1, the stored procedure activity and the set variable activity are linked by a failed dependency. So when stored procedure 1 in Pipeline 1 fails, Pipeline 1 will succeed. And as the Pipeline 1 succeeds, Pipeline 2 will succeed as well. So the correct answer is A. Pipeline 1 and Pipeline 2 succeeded. A company plans to use platform as a service to create the new data pipeline process. The process must meet the following requirements. And the question shows 4 sections: ingest, store, prepare and train, model and serve. For each section, we'll choose the correct answer. For ingesting data, we need to choose the correct answer that can access multiple data sources, provide the ability to orchestrate workflow, provide the capability to run SQL Server integration services packages. And the options are Logic Apps, Azure Data Factory, Azure Automation. Every time we consider a platform that can orchestrate workflow, we can immediately think that what we want is the Azure Data Factory. Looking at the other options, Logic Apps and Azure Automation. Logic Apps is for creating and running automated workflows that integrate your apps, data, services, and systems. And as we discussed in question 1, Azure Automation is more to do with the process automation, configuration, and update management. For data storage, we need to choose a storage that can optimize storage for big data workloads, provide encryption of data at rest, operate with no size limits. And the options are Azure Data Lake Storage, Azure Blob Storage, Azure Files. For these data storage requirements, the correct answer is Azure Data Lake Storage. For Azure Blob Storage, the keyword that we're looking for is unstructured data, and Azure Files isn't the right answer here either, because it offers fully managed file shares in the cloud that are accessible using protocols like SMB. It's useful for replacing on-premises file servers, lift and shift applications, and simplifying cloud development, and so on, but it's not relevant here either. For preparing data and training the model, we need to choose the correct answer that can provide a fully managed and interactive workspace for exploration and visualization, provide the ability to program in R, SQL, Python, Scala, and Java, provide seamless user authentication with Azure Active Directory. And the options are HD Insight Apache Spark Cluster, Azure Databricks, HD Insight Apache Storm Cluster. We need the interactive workspace and visualization. Using a variety of program languages, we can always think of Azure Databricks. The other two options are not relevant. For model and serve, we need to be able to implement native columnar storage, support the SQL language, provide support for structured streaming. HD Insight Apache Kafka Cluster, Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Data Lake Storage. The requirements described here can be met by Azure Synapse Analytics. Apache Kafka is used to build real-time streaming data pipelines and applications. And Azure Data Lake Storage, as we described before, is more to do with the storage options. So the correct answer here is Azure Synapse Analytics. It is worth pointing out that with our selected options, we are looking at a hybrid data warehouse strategy. In fact, few of the data warehousing aspects can also be just carried out on Azure Synapse Analytics, as it's shown on the screen right now. Question 6. You have an Azure Data Factory that contains 10 pipelines. You need to label each pipeline with its main purpose of either ingest, transform, or load. The labels must be available for grouping and filtering when using the monitoring experience in Data Factory. What should you add to each pipeline? B. A correlation ID. C. A run group ID. D. An annotation. You can add annotations to specific Data Factory resources like pipelines, datasets, linked services, and triggers. Using these annotations, you can easily filter and search for specific factory resources that way. So the right answer here is D, an annotation. Looking at other options, a resource tag are metadata elements that are added to Azure resources, not Data Factory pipelines. Kind of similar to the resource tag, correlation IDs are added to resource deployment. So each deployment has a correlation ID, and that can use to track related events. So for example, if you need like an Azure support, you use this correlation ID to identify the operations to examine failed deployments. So for run group ID, so there is this thing called pipeline run ID, which you can get on Data Factory. Otherwise, this option is also irrelevant. Question 7. You need to implement a type 3 slowly changing dimension for product category data in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. You have a table that was created by using the following transact SQL statement. Which two columns should you add to the table? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. To answer this question, we need to understand what each SCD type does. Specifically, we're looking at type 3 SCD. For a type 3 SCD, we have two columns for the dimension member. Either the original value and the new value, or the previous value and the new value. So going by that, the two columns we should add, B, current product category, and E, original product category. So how does this compare to type 2 SCD? So for type 2 SCD, a new row will be added for the new value for the dimension member. Question 8. You have an Azure storage account and a data warehouse in Azure Stream Analytics in the UK South region. You need to copy blob data from the storage account to the data warehouse by using Azure Data Factory. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that the data remains in the UK South region at all times. Minimize administrative effort. Which type of integration runtime should you use? A. Azure Integration Runtime. B. Azure SSIS Integration Runtime. C. Self-hosted Integration Runtime. On the screen, you can see the public network support and private link support for each integration run type. The self-hosted integration runtime is used on premises, so it's not the correct answer here. So the Azure SSIS integration runtime is for executing SSIS packages, so it's not applicable in this situation as well. The correct answer here is A, Azure Integration Runtime. Now to question 9. You have an Azure Stream Analytics job that receives clickstream data from an Azure Event Hubs. You need to define a query in the Stream Analytics job. The query must meet the following requirements. Count the number of clicks within each 10-second window based on the country of a visitor. Ensure that each click is not counted more than once. How should you define the query? And as options, we are given 4 queries here. They are quite similar. The only difference is either the use of the function average or the count, and the difference in the use of the windowing function. To answer this question, it is important to understand what each windowing function does. We're not going to go through here since we're considering the same windowing functions that we did in question 3. So reading the question again, we see that we need to count the number of clicks within each 10-second window, and we have to make sure that each click is not counted more than once. This suggests that there shouldn't be any overlaps between the windows. So the window we should consider here is the tumbling window, which leads us to option B. And indeed, the function is using the count function, which is the function we want to satisfy the requirements specified in this question. Question 10. You need to schedule an Azure Data Factory pipeline to execute when a new file arrives in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container. Which type of trigger should you use? A. On demand. B. Tumbling window. C. Schedule. D. Event. This is a very straightforward question, especially after having gone through question 1. So if you remember from question 1, Data Factory and Synapse pipelines natively integrate with Azure Event Grid, and that enables you to trigger pipelines based on events happening in storage account, like when a file arrives or when a file gets deleted. So the correct answer is D, event. All the other options are irrelevant. You have 2 Azure Data Factory instances named ADF Dev and ADF Prod. ADF Dev connects to an Azure DevOps Git repository. You publish changes from the main branch of the Git repository to ADF Dev. You need to deploy the artifacts from ADF Dev to ADF Prod. What should you do first? A. From ADF Dev, modify the Git configuration. B. From ADF Dev, create a linked service. C. From Azure DevOps, create a release pipeline. D. From Azure DevOps, update the main branch. In Azure Data Factory, there are 3 environments: dev, test, and production. So in this context, continuous integration and delivery means moving Data Factory pipelines from one environment to another. When we want to set up an automated continuous integration of a Data Factory to multiple environments, the first thing to do is to set up a release pipeline on DevOps. So the correct answer here is C. From Azure DevOps, create a release pipeline. Question 12. You are developing a solution that will stream to Azure Stream Analytics. The solution will have both streaming data and reference data. Which storage layer should you use for the reference data? A. Azure Cosmos DB. B. Azure Blob Storage. C. Azure IoT Hub. D. Azure Event Hubs. Quickly going through each options here. Azure Cosmos DB is a database for app development. Azure Blob Storage is a storage that's optimized for storing unstructured data. Azure IoT Hubs is a central message hub for communication between IoT applications and their attached devices. As we briefly discussed before, Azure Event Hubs is a front door to events. It is a platform to stream big data and ingest events. Azure Stream Analytics supports Azure Blob Storage and Azure SQL Database as the storage layer for reference data. So in this case, the correct answer is B, Azure Blob Storage. Question 13. You are designing an Azure Stream Analytics job to process incoming events from sensors in retail environments. You need to process the events to produce a running average of shopper counts during the previous 15 minutes, calculated at 5-minute intervals. Which type of window should you use? A. Snapshot. B. Tumbling. C. Hopping. D. Sliding. We've already gone through a couple of questions that regards windowing functions, so you must be experts by now. So we're not going to go through what each of these windowing functions does again. In this question, we're interested in the windowing function that considers number of events occurring in a fixed time interval at every fixed time interval. So the correct answer here is C, hopping window. Question 14. You're monitoring an Azure Stream Analytics job by using metrics in Azure. You discover that during the last 12 hours, the average watermark delay is consistently greater than the configured late arrival tolerance. What is a possible cause of this behavior? A. Events whose application timestamp is earlier than their arrival time by more than 5 minutes arrive as inputs. B. There are errors in the input data. C. The late arrival policy causes events to be dropped. D. The job lacks the resources to process the volume of incoming data. Let's first discuss what watermarks are in this context. So by the very definition of streams, the incoming event data never stops. So watermarks are there as indicators for the progress to certain points in the stream. And watermark delays indicate the delay of the streaming data processing job. When the streaming pipeline slows down, that's caused by resource constraints. And when the streaming pipeline slows down, the watermark delay occurs. So the right answer here is D. The job lacks the resources to process the volume of incoming data. And the last question, question 15. You plan to build a structured streaming solution in Azure Databricks. The solution will count new events in 5-minute intervals and report only events that arrive during the interval. The output will be sent to a Delta Lake table. Which output mode should you use? A. Update. B. Complete. C. Append. So the big picture of the streaming can be thought of in this way. At every trigger interval, new rows are appended to the input table, and eventually the result table is updated. And whenever the result table is updated, the changed result rows are written to an external sink. The output is defined as what gets written to an external storage. The output can be configured in 3 different modes, which are the options given in this question: update, complete, and append. First, considering update, only the rows that were updated in the result table since the last trigger are written to external storage. And complete, the entire updated result table is written to external storage. Lastly, append, only new rows appended in the result table since the last trigger are written to external storage. So in this question, we need to count new events in 5-minute intervals and report only events that arrive during the interval. So we have first 5 minutes and we get a set of events. And the next 5 minutes, we notice that there is no overlap between the last interval and this interval, and we count fresh new events in this new interval. And the next 5-minute interval occurs, we count the fresh new events again, and so on. Since we're counting new fresh events at every 5-minute interval, the output mode we should use is append. So the correct answer here is C. I hope you smashed the questions, guys. Comment below if you would like an audio version of this, if you want to listen to it on your way to work or at the gym. The sources I studied to answer each question are in the description. I'm planning to make more of these videos, so let me know how I can serve you better. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and share the video with someone you think will ace the exam. We got this together, guys. All the love from studying as you were.